Tibet is a place of great mystery. In this high Himalayan land, there is a caste of high priests known as the Dalai Lamas. These religious and political leaders have governed Tibet since the 16th century and have been some of the most influential figures in Asian history. Many who see Tibet today may struggle to imagine the grandeur and power of these figures, yet they are the most significant line of reincarnated monks in all of Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lamas hail from the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. Although this school is less ancient than its three counterparts in Sakya, Kagyu, and Nyingma, it came to prominence in Tibet with the assistance of the Mongolian warrior tribes to the north. In the Middle Ages, Tibet had been part of the Mongolian Empire, though it had once been an empire of its own. As a result of this conquest, Tibet had been granted special rights in the court of Kublai Khan, and a Tibetan teacher named Pagpa had been the personal spiritual advisor of the great Khan during his rule. With this previous example of priest and patron relations between the Mongolian military leaders and Tibetan hierarchs, the Gelug school hoped to capitalize on this tradition and gain military superiority over the Tibetan plateau. The first Dalai Lama was in fact appointed his title by the Altan Khan, a Mongolian war chief who pledged his religious devotion to the teacher along with his military support. The appointee of this title, Sonam Gyatso, was already a tulku, a reincarnated Lama, who was the third in his line of reincarnations. Because of this, Sonam Gyatso was proclaimed to be the third Dalai Lama, with his previous two incarnations given the titles of the first and second posthumously. Though from central Tibet, the new third Dalai Lama began work among the Mongolian lands in an effort to spread the influence of Buddhism in Mongolia. This was one of the first large-scale efforts of Tibetan missionary work in Mongolia and began to lay the foundation for Mongolia's religious ties to the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. Sonam Gyatso was able to succeed in his efforts to convert many Mongols and further solidified the military and political support of the Mongolian warrior clans. While on his mission, he succumbed to illness on the shores of a lake in Mongolian lands and never was able to return to Tibet. With the growing number of tulkus and contention for authority in Tibet, the situation was fragile for the Gelug school, and it seemed unlikely that a new successor to the third Dalai Lama would emerge at all. In fact, as searches began to locate the reincarnated Lama, tensions and disagreements arose about who the successor would be. However, the former advisor to Sonam Gyatso used a cunning trick in his appointment and endorsement of the eventual fourth Dalai Lama. He did this by appointing a boy from Mongolia and a grandson of the same Altan Khan who had formerly appointed the third Dalai Lama. This greatly enhanced the relationship between the Gelug and the Mongols and provided the Gelug with a Mongolian army to defend the new Lama, of whom the Mongolians were most proud of for being from among their own people. Though the fourth Dalai Lama was significant in the development of Mongolian and Tibetan relations, his rule was short-lived. In his mid-20s, he began to grow ill and died soon after being taken to medicinal hot springs outside the capital of Lhasa. This began a renewed effort to seize political power in Tibet. The king of the realm of Tsang, a region in central Tibet, had acquired the lands adjacent to his kingdom and was proclaiming his own superiority, and his reign sponsored high lamas from different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Despite attempts at negotiating an accommodation of the Dalai Lamas underneath the Tsang king, the Gelug insisted on appointing their new leader themselves. This was eventually allowed by the king, though he condemned many tulkus at the time. In fact, the next Dalai Lama was a very popular candidate tulku and had been sought after by the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism to lead their own respective orders. The fifth Dalai Lama was from a family of wealthy aristocrats who lived in an ancient castle where the fifth Dalai Lama, Lobsang Gyatso, would spend much of his childhood. Constantly on the run from the Gelug and Mongol attempts to use him for their own political means, Lobsang was eventually taken in by a teacher who initiated a test to verify his identity as the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lamas. He did this by placing in front of him various items, some of which belonged to the former Dalai Lamas, and some of them being random items. By successfully choosing the items that belonged to him in his previous reincarnation, the candidate Tulku would confirm his election to the point of the new Dalai Lama. Interestingly, the fifth Dalai Lama failed this test utterly by his own autobiography, yet the teacher still proceeded with his initiation. This event, described by the Dalai Lama himself, illustrated how desperate the Gelug school was for a leader during this time. They certainly chose a man with great fortitude and of high intelligence, however. With the aid of a newly established alliance with the Mongolian chief Gushi Khan, the Gelug once again had an army of Mongolians behind them to protect their influences. Their chief rival for power in Tibet remained the King of Tsang, who had united much of central Tibet and led an ethnically Tibetan army. The advisor or Deshi of the fifth Dalai Lama, Sonam Chopal, in his bitterness for the transgressions against the Gelug school, offered a message to the Khan with the authority of the Dalai Lama, suggesting that he overtake the stronghold of the King of Tsang. This bold move by the Deshi was concerning for many Tibetans, as the Mongols were known to be fierce and brutal opponents, and cared little for the preservation of the ancient towns and monasteries on their warpath. Yet the new war had begun, and soon the Mongols had beaten back the King of Tsang to his fortress of Shigatse, where a long and cruel siege ensued. The Deshi, in his fear, had asked the Dalai Lama to intervene with ritual magic, as slowly his nerve began to fail as the siege continued to progress. Though angered by the use of his power to provoke a war that seemed unjust, the Dalai Lama revealed a victory for the Mongols by entering into a terrifying trance. Sure enough, the Mongols were soon victorious over the King of Tsang, and Gushi Khan met the Dalai Lama on the battlefield. Here they exchanged gifts in a significant and historic ceremony. The most incredible gift was that of Tibet itself, which Gushi gave to the Dalai Lama, even as Kublai Khan had once given to Pagba many centuries ago. The remainder of the armies of Tsang were hunted down, the hierarchs of the other schools were chased out of Tibet or brought into submission, and for the first time, the Dalai Lama and the Gelug school held supreme authority in the lands of Tibet. This religious and political establishment would be the precedent for Tibetan rule in the centuries which followed.